Sure, I think we'll start.
Yes, sir. We can give it a go. Okay. Let me follow up. Good morning, everybody. We from the family of IHM are presenting this seminar. We have Mr. Uday Balaji here, a whiskey evangelist, and with various worldwide experience running around with the terms of beverages. Uh, the introduction is going to be handled on from Mr. Pranav. Mr. Pranav, please take on.
Sure, sir. Thank you. Good morning and cheers to everyone here. Mark Twain once said, "Too much of anything is bad, but too much of good whiskey is barely enough." This is a journey through the life of whiskey, or as I like to call it, the fountain of youth. And to help us navigate through this journey, we of IHM Chennai welcome Mr. Uday Balaji. Mr. Uday Balaji is a whiskey evangelist and a founder of Whisky Advisor. After a successful and diverse career across technology, business, and restaurants, he decided to pursue his two passions, travel and whiskey. Sir has been to over 100 distilleries and had whiskey experiences across Scotland, Ireland, Japan, the US, and beyond. He is a trainer for the prestigious Ambassador course in India and also India's first and only executive bourbon steward. He conducts events, tasting training, and has a weekly podcast called the Whisky Advisor Show. Sir has also started a YouTube channel which will be a one-stop shop to know everything about whiskey. And yes, sir, we do need knowledgeable whiskey communities in India because what whiskey will not cure, there's no cure for. And with this, I would like to pass it on to you, sir, to start the webinar. Good morning, sir. It's good to have you here.
Good morning, Sanal, and good morning to everyone. Thank you so much for having me here. It's an absolute privilege to be here with all of you. Just to begin with, I'd just like to thank everyone who's been involved in putting this together. Dr. Eugene, Mr. Manigandan, Sanal, Pranav, Rachna, and Arvind, thank you very much for doing this. So, guys, like I said, delighted to be here. And I think we can just dive right in to the presentation. Thank you, Sanal, for such a generous introduction as well. I'm just going to share my screen and I will. Just one second. Wonderful. So, as you have seen from the poster, the topic for today is going to be a journey through the history and flavor of whiskey. But just a couple of requests. One, keep your videos on. I like to see who I'm talking to. And secondly, participate. There is no silly question. I'm sure you have some really good questions as well. So please feel free to ask me anything. I think we have the Q&A at the end. So please feel free to just type in all your questions and I'll answer as many as I can. Sanal, is that right?
Yes, absolutely.
Okay, perfect. All right, so let's dive right into it. I'm just going to start off with a question. So just imagine this scenario, right? So all of you guys are out of college and you've gone to a hotel, you're working in a bar, and a guest walks in and he asks for a whiskey. And he doesn't really know much about it. He doesn't know what a single malt is. He doesn't know what a blend is. He doesn't know what a bourbon is. So, what could you possibly do, or what could you possibly know at this point in time to elevate this guest experience? He just wants to try a whiskey because he hasn't had one before, but he drinks alcohol. Right. So, what do you think will elevate his experience? I'd love to know if you could type it in the chat box and Sanal could just read it out. Anything that could elevate the guest experience? I'd say whiskey is a gentleman's drink, but having said that, Okay, so let's Anil read it.
Yes, sir. So we have a question. We have a comment from Mr. Mani sir of IHM Chennai. He's told whiskey is a gentleman's drink.
Okay. We'll just note it down and I'll talk about it as we go along.
And we have one of our third years telling Mr. Akhil Swami is telling us we'll ask the guest preferences. And we have one of our second year students I would recommend him premium peg single malt Scotch on the rocks.
Okay. Okay. So I just noted that down. So let me just jump into what I noted down, right? So it comes down to, I think the point about asking the guest preference is absolutely critical. Because if we're not listening, we're not going to be able to sell, upsell, sell on, or anything, right? So the first thing is understand who your guest is. And the second thing is so you can't really control his preferences, right? But you can be prepared in order to tailor his experience based on whatever he says. So first thing, you need to know the products in your bar. You need to know the brands. And then in those brands, you need to know about the expressions. You need to know the flavor profiles of these particular brands. And then once you choose the whiskey for him, you got to see, what stories can I add to this. And in order to understand all this, one, you need to have context. So first of all, what is the difference between a single malt and a bourbon? What is the difference between an Irish whiskey and Scotch, right? And there's a lot of this has to do with how history worked around all these spirits. And secondly, also how the stuff made. Why again is why does a bourbon taste different from a single malt? So you need, in order to really understand how to improve your guest experience, your knowledge needs to be strong to begin with. Or even, although cocktails is something that I don't cover at all, you need to know your spirits before you get into cocktails, because cocktails are very cool. And bourbon and rye, what really brought cocktails to the forefront in London at places like the Savoy Hotel, right? Savoy Bar. Now, how I'm going to do this is I'm going to take you through a walk through history, right? So we're going to look back at how how whiskey traveled around the world and why the whiskeys are so different from a historical angle, to give context, right? So this began many centuries ago. In fact, this began all the way back 2000 BC is where we look at the first, stories of distillation. And distillation is very important. I'll talk about this a little later when we're talking about the flavors of whiskey. But it is in the Arab world that they started the distillation, and they started distilling medicines and powders. So, in fact, the word alcohol comes from the term al-kohl, the fine powder, kohl that you put on your eyelashes. So that's where it started, and then what happened was this knowledge moved across from the Middle East into mainland Europe. So monks, crusaders, all these people carried the knowledge, and the first records of distilling were in Salerno in Italy in the 1100s, right? So what was happening then is the monks were making medicines, they were making perfumes and things like that, and then this knowledge spread through mainland Europe. And because of that origin of medicine, they started calling it the water of life in whichever local language. So even now, if you go to like France, you would see eau de vie. If you go to the Scandinavian countries, you'll see aquavit. Now, what happened was this knowledge slowly moved from mainland Europe through Irish monks, who were the most knowledgeable people at the time. The knowledge moved to Ireland. So let's say we ask Scotsman, where did whiskey originate from? The Scotsman is going to very proudly say Scotland, of course. But the reality was it was monks in Ireland who first started making this water of life, again, which they called pushka. Pushka is water, is life, in the language Gaelic, which is spoken in Ireland. So as Indians, we know what happens when the British land up, and then slowly things start getting anglicized. So Ushka became Ushka, Ushki, and finally what we know it as whiskey now. Right. So what they used to use back then was not. See, now we need to understand this is all a very what do you say, corporate world right now when it comes to spirits. But how spirits started off historically was, like local farmers, local landlords used to take whatever grain that they used to have. Before it's spoiled, they'll distill it and keep it so that it can be preserved. Those are the origins, right? And so they used to make the whiskey from barley, oats, wheat, rye, any grain basically that they could get a hold of. So in fact, one of the early styles of, in fact, whiskey back in the day was not what we have now, which is an aged liquid. It used to just be a white dog, basically a colorless liquid like this, which used to be made palatable by adding spices and herbs and everything. Kind of to an extent like what gin is to an extent, right? So the origins of whiskey were in Ireland, and then it was the Irish that took this knowledge to Scotland. In fact, if you guys have had Lafroig or whatever it is, Lafroig, Lagavulin, or Bomo, that comes from the island of Islay. And the Isle of Islay is very, very close. It's just a short ferry ride from Northern Ireland. So that's how the knowledge moved there. Scotsman is going to argue this, but it is fact, right? In fact, the first records of distilling in the world are in 1405. Yeah, it's not very auspicious because it was a chief who drank too much of. The chief who drank too much of aquavitae and ended up dying. So we will talk about responsible drinking later, a little later on in this session. Yeah, but just to start off, I'll be showing you a few bottles as we go by. So this is the most common Irish whiskey, Jameson, and this is a blend. But originally, the most widely made whiskey in Ireland used to be single malt, and after a certain point in time, they started making another style called single pot still, which I recommend you look up as well. Yeah, and so then what happened was, so this knowledge moved to Scotland, but it was the Irish who was still a dominant force in the world. They used to make 70% of all world whiskey in the early 1900s. But what changed was this one device called the coffee still. So the Irish, and I'll be talking about this later, like single malt whiskey is made in pot still, which is a very manual, labor-intensive process and very expensive. That's why single malts are expensive. But he came up with this thing that could distill spirit 24/7, 365, and make really cheap spirit, which came to be called grain whiskey. So now what happened was they took malt whiskey and then mixed it with the grain whiskey and ended up with blended Scotch. And this is one of the main reasons that Scotch whiskey went on to rule the world, right? So even now, blended Scotch is okay. Why is it not visible? Sanil, could you just tell me from when it was not visible?
From this slide, sir.
This one, huh? Can you see it now?
Sir,
Can you see it now? Let me try again. How about now?
Yes, sir.
Okay, I think somebody else started presenting, so it will probably get out of. Okay, so even if you see now, 90% of all exports from Scotland is blended Scotch. Single malt is actually a very fairly small part of the market, right? And so far we've spoken about how Ireland dominated, and then how Scotch took over with the invention of this coffee still and started making blended Scotch whiskey. But there are five top whiskey makers in the world, which is one is Ireland, Scotland, and the other three are the US, Canada, and Japan. Right. So now let's talk about the other three whiskey countries. So what happened was just like so basically immigrants moved from Europe to North America, whether it was Canada or the US. So when people landed up in the US, I'll talk about that initially. So the first thing that they do, they've been on a long journey. So the first thing that they want to start doing is, have a drink, relax. So they started initially distilling what you call rye whiskey. So I'll show you an example of that. It's not very common in India, but this is the rye that's very popular in cocktails in the US. Actually, it's Pikesville. So they started making this rye, and in fact, some of the liquor barons in the US initially were the ones who started building political careers as well. In fact, one of the early distillers in the US was George Washington. Yeah. So then what happened was slowly people started moving west, and then they landed up in now what we call Kentucky and Tennessee, where they found absolutely beautiful water for making whiskey and an absolute abundance of corn, right? So then they started making this corn whiskey, and then eventually over the years, it started to become standardized, and you started having bourbon, right? So Maker's Mark is one of the bourbons that's available in India. So this is one of the most widely sold bourbons. The most widely sold would be Jim Beam, right? And the most widely sold Tennessee whiskey would be Jack Daniels. So essentially, it was that distilling knowledge from Europe, which had come from the Middle East, that then went to Ireland and Scotland. And then these immigrants brought the knowledge to the US, which then moved to Kentucky and Tennessee. And then this new corn spirit was born. Just for definition's sake, if you want to know what bourbon is, it has to have at least 51% corn. And then the other grains that go into it could be rye, barley, and wheat. Yeah. So that's the story of how it got to the US. Now, how did it get to Japan? So now you see how this whole cycle comes together. In 1853, so Japan is completely blockaded to the outside world. And there was this really daring American captain called Commodore Perry, sorry, not captain, Commodore Perry, who broke the blockade and went into the Tokugawa shogunate and met the representatives there. And when he went to meet them, he ended up bringing. So one of the many gifts that he brought, it is believed, was a barrel of rye whiskey, which then the ball started rolling then, and it took quite a while for Japanese whiskey to really gain ground. In fact, it was two gentlemen. One was Shinjiro Tori, who started Suntory, and another gentleman, Masataka Taketsuru, who started Nikka. So those are the two brands. If you guys are familiar with any Japanese whiskey brands, those are the two powerhouse brands. But it was only in the early 80s that they actually started making single malt. And yes, Yamazaki is one of the Suntory single malts. In fact, it was Taketsuru who helped Shinjiro Tori set up, the distillery of Yamazaki. Hibiki is the blend, Yoichi is Nikka single malt from Hokkaido, right? So now just moving on. So in the 80s, they started making single malt, like the gentleman was saying. So it was first Yamazaki Suntory from the Yamazaki distillery, and then you started having Hakushu, Yoichi, Miyagi, Kyo. Those are the four big brands. And then the blends are Hibiki and the Nikka blends. Now, what happened was in the 1980 to about the early 2000s, nobody was buying this. They were making these whiskeys. So these absurdly expensive Yamazakis and everything that you see now were actually languishing on shelves in Japanese liquor stores. So it's kind of like, guys who bought it then, kind of like the Bitcoin buyers of the early 2000s. Right? So they hit the jackpot. But then what happened was there was this movie called Lost in Translation, which Bill Murray is doing a Suntory whiskey ad, and this really caught the imagination of the American whiskey drinking audience. And then, starting in the early 2000s, Japanese whiskey just started winning awards left, right, and center across the world, and they've really come to prominence now. Unfortunately, with whiskey, unlike gin or vodka, you can't make it today and sell it tomorrow. It takes 12 years or 15 years or 18 years or whatever it is. A minimum of 3 years. So what happened was Japanese whiskey is becoming so popular, and all those dusties sitting on the liquor store shelves started disappearing, and $200 bottle suddenly was selling for $1,000, and now it's probably selling for $2,000. So now what they're doing is they're building up stocks in order to be able to bring these whiskeys out. So a lot of the time what people say is, oh, Japanese whiskey is the best in the world, it's better than Scotch, better than this, better than that. Not really. The prices are driven by the fact that it is very scarce. And the Japanese whiskey laws are very lax as well. So just be careful when you're buying Japanese whiskey, if you do, to make sure that it's actually made in Japan. Just a word of caution. So I didn't speak about Canada because Canadian whiskey is just coming up. It has a reputation of making really good quality rye whiskies. I would suggest you look it up. There's only one in India, which is the Canadian Club. It's quite a decent whiskey for mixing for any of you mixologists out there. Just an example of Hakushu, one that I've got here, is this is the lightly peated Suntory whiskey. Now, we live in India, right? So as you know, whiskey into culture in India. Dewars and Glenfiddich and all this. So they shared some photos of how there were offices set up in India in the 1800s by Grant's Whiskey and by Dewars, which is absolutely mind-blowing. And apparently there were casks of whiskey brought by the British when they ruled India. And all this led in the 1800s, I believe it was 1820s. There was a gentleman by the name of Edward Dyer, who set up a distillery called Dyer Brewery actually initially in Himachal Pradesh, not too far from Chandigarh. And he started brewing beer, which is lion beer, which is the first one in the whole of Asia. Not the lion beer that we have now, but this was basically for the garrisons that were stationed there. And then slowly he started making grain and malt whiskey, which then became this brand called Solon Number One, which I believe my uncles used to drink back in the day. I just managed to get a bottle of it. It's okay, like a 400 rupee blend. Recently they come out with the Solon Gold, right? Now, you to know about Solon is over time it became Dyer Meakin and then it became Mohan Meakin. You'd probably be familiar with the name. They also make the iconic Old Monk rum. But over time, what happened was due to grain shortages, due to a number of things, also, what happened was whiskey started becoming cheaper and cheaper. In order to make it cheaper, you need to start putting neutral alcohol and putting coloring and flavoring in order to get like a 200 rupee bottle and 300 rupee bottle. So Indian whiskey has gained this reputation of being made from molasses, neutral alcohol made from the byproduct of making sugar. We're a big sugar making country. But this is slowly changing and we're moving more towards grain alcohol. This is a broader topic, I'm just touching on it. But the top 10 whiskies in the world, out of them, 7 are Indian brands, right? This is a Forbes listing that I have on the presentation. But most of these whiskies wouldn't cut it in terms of EU definitions or American definitions because they have that molasses in it. So it would be classified as a rum. But some people have changed this. So you have brands like Amrut, which launched their first single malt in 2004, Paul John in 2012, if I'm not wrong, and Rampur in 2016. So Amrut really, opened things up for the Indian single malt market. And then it was, so they're based in Bangalore. And then you have Paul John, who are based in Goa. Again, all very, very fine single malts. And the latest entrant would be Rampur. Again, fine whiskies. Little hard to find in India, admittedly. And one which is, I think still has a long way to go, but Peter Scott Black single malt, which is okay. But there are 5 single malts in India. So what I would as the new brigade of hospitality professionals, um, if you take, if you ask a Scotsman what is the best whiskey in the world, he'll say it's Scotch. What are you talking about? If you ask an American, depending on whether he comes from Kentucky or Tennessee or wherever, he'll say, oh, bourbon, obviously, or Tennessee whiskey, Jack Daniels, whatever. But there's really not that much pride. When you ask an Indian, they'll say, oh yeah, like, it's Johnny Walker, Glenfiddich or whatever. But we have equally good whiskeys in India. So whenever you can legally drink, I would recommend trying these, give it a shot. If you like it, talk about it and popularize it. We should be proud about what we have in India. And there's this whole go vocal for local thing going on. I think it should be go vocal for quality, local, and other Indian spirits as well. There are some good gins out there. There's Feni, there's Mahua. Look for it and promote it. So, any questions? So that really kind of wraps up the historic part of it and how whiskey traveled the world. So, if you guys have any questions at this point, I'd be happy to take it, and then we can go on to the next section. We could.
So we have a question from our training coordinator from IHM Chennai. He's asking, are Indian single malts really malt whiskies or grain whiskies?
So the Indian single malts, the 5 that I spoke about, they're all malt whiskies, right? So I'll talk about the definitions a little later, but just to quickly put it in perspective, a single malt is a whiskey made from 100% barley from one distillery, right? Now, in 2018, the FSSAI came out with a definition for what the different liquors are. So if you look up whiskey, there are 2 definitions. One is single malt and one is blended. The single malt is pretty much on par with any other laws in the world. So I think it's very good. So if you see an Indian single malt, you are getting that 100% barley from one distillery. I'd be happy to share that link after this for anyone who wants to look it up. But it's basically the 2018 FSSAI Gazette. The tricky bit is when you talk about blended whiskey, because they allow the usage of neutral alcohol, and you need only 2%, a minimum of 2% of grain or malt spirit in it. That's why it gets murky. But like I keep saying, right, we consume 50% of the world's whiskey. So for somebody to come and tell us that our laws are wrong, it would be a little high-handed. That's what the Scotch Whisky Association does. Personally, do I agree that you shouldn't be making something out of molasses spirit and calling it whiskey? I personally agree with it, but I'm, not a person in authority. Cool. So any other questions, or would you like to move on?
So you can move on to the next.
Okay.
We'll have another Q&A session by the end of the session.
All right. So the next thing, so one thing that you need to keep in mind, right? So I spoke about it before. So whiskey is an agricultural product. There are only 3 ingredients that go into whiskey, right? I'm talking Western definitions. So it's grain, water, and yeast. That's it that can go into your whiskey. Now, what is the difference between whiskey and rum and brandy and all this stuff? So like I said, it was farmers who started making this stuff. So let's say if you go to France, they have grapes. So they make wine and they make brandy. If you go to Germany, they make beer. They've got an abundance of wheat. And then if you go to a place like Scotland or Ireland, you've got oats, you've got barley, and then you make whiskey out of that. So rum is made from sugarcane and molasses. So that's what differentiates it, right? But fundamentally what it is all of them require a sugar source. You need sugar to make alcohol, plain and simple. So in whiskey, what do you use? You use corn, you use wheat, you use rice, barley, and any other cereal grain that you can use. So now, does the whiskey flavor come only from grain? No, it comes also from other factors, and we will talk about it. I'm just going to quickly. Okay, I think someone else is presenting. Can you still see my screen? Can you see my screen? Anyone? Yeah. Okay. Cool. All right. So what I've done so far is to give you a context of how are these whiskies different in terms of a historical context and how it moved across the world. But really, at the end of the day, it comes down to the chemistry of making whiskey, and that's where the flavor comes from, right? So what I would like to do is quickly go through the production of whiskey, and for the purpose of keeping it short, I'm only going to look at malt whiskey. There's a lot more other production, but this gives you most of the you know, it gives you an overview of the process. So first of all, you get grain and it goes into a silo, right? And it goes through what's called a malting process. So if any of you have ever taken a seed and then put it in the ground and waited for it to sprout, basically what's happening is when you water that soil with the seed in it, it thinks that it's raining and it's time to start sprouting and consume that starch in the seed. So this is exactly what we do in malting. So if you heard of malt, this is what it is. You steep the grain in water, you germinate it, but then you don't want it to fully start sprouting and finish off all that starch. Then you're not going to get, the alcohol, which is the worst case scenario. So what you do is you have to heat it. And when you heat it, you're drying it and you're stopping the germination, and that's what's called kilning, as you can see. So historically, what used to happen was in Scotland and Ireland, they used to heat the houses with this thing called peat. So it's like a half carbonized vegetation that's freely available. They'll go dig it, dry it, and then use it to heat the houses. So that's the heat source. They used to use the same thing to heat the barley. So you can see, they put the fire below, and then that smoke gets into your barley, and all that smoke gets stuck to your husk. So now what happens is that flavor goes right through the process. But in that peat, you had all the vegetation of that region. So if it's on like an island, you've got seaweed and all that is salty, mossy vegetation. If you're in the mainland, you have trees. You've got very dry, brown, earthy flavors. So if you've tried a whiskey like an Ardmore, you get an earthy flavor because of Highland peat. And if you've tried like a Lafroig, it tastes like iodine. That's because of the seaweed, right? So that's the story of barley. So this is a sprouting barley as a picture that I took, I think, in Bomo Distillery on Isla. So all these pictures are pictures that I've taken from different distilleries during my travels. So now what you have is you have your barley and you just grind it, and then it's called the process of milling. So what you're doing is you're just breaking it up so that you take it, so it's like this, right? So it's just ground down from that previous grain, and you take it to the next process, which is called mashing. Mashing, essentially what you're doing is you're taking hot water and you're dropping it on the grain and dissolving that starch out to get a sugar water. And whatever is left is called the called the draff, and that goes as cattle feed. So there's a lot of happy cows in Scotland and Ireland. And this is what the process looks like. So if you see from that arm, water is dropped down on the grist, which is what comes out of the milled barley. And then this is where the action begins, right? So all we're really doing at this point is making beer. So you take that wort, which is the sugary water, you put it in what's called a washback or a fermenter, and you pitch yeast into it. So now what you get out of this is you get alcohol, carbon dioxide, and what's called esters and congeners. I think somebody mentioned it on the chat. So these, okay, are you guys able to see the presentation? I think Mr. Akil said it's not visible. Thumbs up if you can see it.
Sir, it is visible.
Okay. All right. So what happens is, so this is where the alcohol comes into the picture. We haven't had any alcohol so far, right? But this is where a lot of that flavor comes from. So if you see, the grain gives a certain flavor. And then now when the yeast starts acting on the wort, it gives you ethanol, but it also gives you other alcohols, and then you get what's called esters and congeners, which are your different flavors, right? Now, what happens with this is you, so for example, let's say if you take a compound called ethyl pentanoate, right? This is a naturally occurring ester, which happens to be in green apples. So, and this also happens to be formed in some fermentation processes. So, if you get a whiskey and then you get these tasting notes that says tastes like bananas and ripe berries, those are esters that are being formed during fermentation or maturation, where nobody is adding pineapple or apple or any of that to the whiskey, right? So this is the fermentation process, and then you get the what you get at the end of this is a beer. It's also called wash, which is about a 5 to 10% ABV beer. Now, in order to get whiskey, 5 to 10 ABV is not enough. You need at least 40% ABV. So you remember earlier we spoke about how in 2000 AD there was this process called distillation. That is very key now, because the only way that you can increase that alcohol percentage is by separating the water and the alcohol due to the two different boiling distillation. So this is the fermentation. I think this, I don't remember which distillery this was, but that's how your washback looks, a fermenter. And this is how it looks. Let me see if I can play this. Yeah. So you can see how active this fermentation is. This is from a bourbon distillery called Bardstown Bourbon Company. So, and this is, they're not boiling anything. This is how actively the yeast works on that wort to convert it to alcohol. And you see all those bubbles are the carbon dioxide coming. So moving on to distillation. So all that kind of foaming and all will stop after the yeast consume all the sugar and dye, and then you put it into your stills. So essentially what you're doing here is you're boiling up that liquid, and alcohol boils at 78.4 degrees and water, as you know, boils at 100. So that fractional distillation is what brings out that final, what you call new make spirit. So this is new make from an Indian distillery, right? So I'm not really going to get into the really technical distillation parts. I believe I shared a blog, so you can just take a look at that. Don't want to get too geeky, but basically what you get is you get between a 60 to 70% typically new make spirit, which is completely clear, like this, right? And so typically in Scotland, you distill twice, and typically in Ireland, you distill thrice, although there are exceptions. Don't believe anybody if they say that all Irish whiskey is triple distilled. Most of it is, not all, right? So now you have the new make at this point, and these, I took these pictures in the still house at Glenmorangie. So you can see the tall stills. They made out of copper because they heat evenly and they're malleable, and they also remove sulfur. Now, if you get a clear spirit like this, then how do you end up with a color like this? Now, this is a question that some of you might have. And this comes entirely from the casks that the whiskey, that the new make is aged in, right? So now, historically, what used to happen was, like I said earlier, right, there wasn't any aging. People were drinking whiskey, which was basically a new make spirit, which had herbs and spices and stuff in it, just to make it palatable. And over time, nobody knows really how this started, but people started putting this new make in casks. You've got to understand this is like the 1800s and stuff, right? We didn't have like plastic containers and steel containers and all that. They were not ubiquitous. Now, so they had to use casks, whether it is for grain or salt or sugar or whatever. So they put even the new make into the cask, so what they called whiskey at the time. And then they realized after a certain point that that sulfury kind of nasty rough edges around the spirit was being taken away, and a certain mellowness and sweetness and color was being added from the wood. And initially, the woods that were used were basically sherry casks that used to come from the south of Spain, from a region called Jerez de la Frontera and two other places, the Sherry Triangle, because people used to drink a lot of sherry in England. Now, and that gives a certain character, and it's typically made from European oak. But what happened in the 60s was in bourbon, they came out with the law saying that all bourbon should be aged in new charred oak casks, which meant there was an absolute glut in the market of these used bourbon casks. And then that became the predominant cask that was used to age whiskey. So most of the whiskeys that you see now are bourbon cask aged, and a little more of the luxury whiskeys and the higher end whiskeys that you'll start seeing more sherry cask aged. There are different flavors that comes from these casks. That's a little more technical. But broadly what you do is you toast the cask and char the cask. Toasting gives you compounds like vanillin, which gives you a vanilla flavor. And the charring gives you a layer of coal, which basically acts like activated charcoal, which removes bad flavors in your new make. That's as technical as we're going to get. And if you've noticed, I've been saying casks. I have not been saying barrels, because a barrel is a type of cask. An American standard barrel, like what is used for crude, your crude oil, is a 200-liter barrel, which is an American standard barrel. But there are a plethora of casks from like a 50-liter all the way up to a 700-liter. And I saw that somebody mentioned oak cask. Scotch whiskey has to be, matured in oak cask. So does bourbon, for example. But some other countries give a little more leeway. For example, in Irish whiskey, you can use chestnut and acacia and cherry. I've tasted these whiskeys, and they give very, very interesting flavor profiles. So laws vary from country to country. So this is a picture I took from the Bruichladdich distillery on Islay again. So that copper thing that you see is called a valanche or a thief, basically to take whiskey out of the cask for sampling. Right. So any questions? So that is the broad production part of whiskey. And so the flavors, like we talk about, the cereally, malty, sweet grain flavors obviously come from your grain. Your fermented, fruity and floral flavors come from your fermentation and from your maturation because of esters and congeners. And your peated flavor comes from that peat that they use in the malting process. And that pretty much covers it. I mean, you'll get a little bit of these winey kind of flavors that come from the sherry or whatever cask that's been used to mature the whiskey. I think Rachna, you're asking questions.
Sir, before that, I will just welcome Chef Ananthakrishan, sir, Chef
Hello,
Chandra Kumar, and Mr. Michael Santosh from IHM Fraternity.
Hello, everyone.
Thank you. Over to you, Rachna.
Sir, do you want me to ask the questions now, or can we have it by the end of the session, sir?
End of the session also works. Okay, so
then
let's move on then.
I'll give you continuity, yeah. Thank you.
Okay. All right, so now what we talked about was essentially the production of single malt whiskey. So in all these distilleries, the ones that we've looked at, Bowmore, Springbank, Bruichladdich, Glenmorangie, all these are Scotch distilleries that make single malt whiskey. Single malt is basically 100% barley from one distillery, and there are more technical things like Scotch needs to be aged at least 3 years, and it has to be only on the isle on Scotland and all that. But that is more of the nitty-gritty that you can read up on. But just to quickly talk about the different types of Scotch, right? So there are two different types. So we have the malt distillery, which we just looked at, which you make that whiskey using pot stills and 100% barley. A grain whiskey comes from a distillery which uses, you remember that coffee stills we saw, the column stills, uses that and uses barley, but can also use other grains with that barley to make a grain whiskey. I don't know if you can see that Loch Lomond, the red one up there, that's a single grain whiskey. And now if you take a single malt, which is like this Aberfeldy, I'm going to turn it. So there's an Aberfeldy, which is a Highland single malt. And then you have Dewar's, which is a blended Scotch. So what happens is you take a single malt and you take a grain whiskey and you mix them together, blend them together, you get a blended whiskey. So one of the single malts in this Dewars is Aberfeldy, right? And let's say if you take Aberfeldy and then you mix it with, say, this is a bad example. Let's assume that this is a Scotch single malt. You mix these two together, you get a blended malt. So if you see over my shoulder, the monkey shoulder back there, that's a blended malt whiskey, which is made from 3 single malts, which is Glenfiddich, the Balvenie, and Keenanby. Yeah. So you have single malt, you have single grain, and then you have a blended malt, which is only a blend of single malts like the monkey shoulder. You have a blended grain. I don't have a bottle of that, but just basically a blend of multiple single grains. And single blended grains are quite rare. Blended malts are slowly coming back. So you have monkey shoulder, green label, you've got copper dog, brands like that. But the big one, the big Scotch is your blended Scotch. 90% of the market is your blended Scotch, which is a blend of multiple single malts and multiple single grains. Yeah, that's just something to remember before you go out to talk about what the different types are. That's just a very basic grounding. Now, moving on, I would like to run you through a quick tasting of how to taste whiskey in a structured manner. But there's one thing that I'll tell you to begin with. There's a difference between tasting whiskey and drinking whiskey. Whiskey for the longest time has been a bit of a snobbish drink. One of my endeavors, and right now even the broad industry, is to pull out the snobbery from whiskey and make it more accessible. So if somebody tells you you should only drink whiskey neat or with 1 cube of ice, that's all rubbish. At the end of the day, you drink whiskey. If it's your whiskey, you drink it however you want. And if a guest walks into your bar and they want to put Coke in a 25-year-old whiskey, hey, I don't agree with it, but then that's his whiskey. He can drink it whichever way he wants. What you can do is recommend ways to elevate the whiskey, be it like, for example, one of the things that I do on a Sunday afternoon, I'm not a big gin and tonic person. So what I do is I make a highball. I take Lafroig, half ginger ale, half soda, and it's a great highball for an afternoon drink. Yeah. So how can you elevate the person's tasting experience is something that you should be looking at. You can do whatever you want to your whiskey, make cocktails, whatever it is, right? But for the purpose of today, I'm only going to be talking about how to taste whiskey in a structured manner. And this is a tasting sheet. So if you can see it, you can see I put the whiskey. This is something that I use. So I look at color, I look at visual texture, and then I look at the nose, I look at the palate, mouthfeel, and the finish, right? So quickly to run you through it, number one, I wish I'd put up the chart, but anyway, that's okay. So if you see, color will give you a general idea. I'm saying a very general idea of what cask might have been used and how old the whiskey is. But if you look at the back of most bottles, so I don't know if you guys can see this, but it'll say added color E158. So what happens is you can add color in Scotch, Irish, Indian, whatever, in order to standardize the color. But some brands, what they do is they take it a little far and try to make the whiskey rich. So don't equate color with quality. Classic example is an Ardbeg 10 that I have back there, packed with flavor, but very light in color, right? So it's just an indication. When you get more and more advanced in your whiskey knowledge, you'll be able to make out more and more about color. So now with the visual texture, what we're looking for is when you rotate the whiskey in your glass, it's kind of like wine, right? So do the legs come down slowly or do they come down fast? In wine, that tells you a lot about the ABV, but don't think on those lines in whiskey. What you're essentially looking is you're looking at what mouthfeel you could possibly expect. Is it going to be watery? Is it going to be oily? Is it going to be somewhere in the middle? It depends. Yeah, and there's no good or bad or anything. It depends on what you like. And for me, some days I'd like a rich, heavy whiskey. Some days I'd like something really light. So now, then what we go on to is the nose. The nose is actually the most important part of the entire tasting. And I'll tell you, if when you try anything, taste anything, close your nose, take a mouthful. You won't taste anything. You open it, you'll get a plethora of flavors. Yeah. And for that, for the nose and the palate, I use a very, very simple flavor wheel for my sessions. But you can even get flavor wheels like that, which goes down to the chemical compounds. Yeah. With me so far?
Yes, sir, you're on.
Yeah. Okay. So we spoke about these different flavors: cereal, peaty, fruity, floral, winey, fainty. All this stuff is to give you a reference. But don't get stuck by this, right? So at the end of the day, whiskey or any spirit or alcoholic beverage should be kind of like music, you know. Uh, I know you guys are really young, but so let's say you listen to a song, and a lot of songs are associated with memories. It could be make you happy, it could make you sad, whatever it is. And aromas are the same. And you need to keep exposing yourself to aromas. Go to a flower market, go to a fruit shop, wear a mask these days, just bring it down a little bit and smell. But keep expanding your repertoire. In fact, yesterday I had these personal sessions with this gentleman who runs the Asian School of Tea. So we keep exchanging knowledge about tea, coffee, different spirits, perfumery, even water. Because the more you learn about other things and the aroma spectrum, the more you learn about what you're really interested in, rather than pigeonholing yourself, right? And for example, for me, one of the flavors that I talk about is when I smell a really woody whiskey, it reminds me of my grandmother's cupboard. Have fun. Don't get into the snobbery of it. Enjoy your nosing and tasting, whether it's wine, whether it's whiskey, whatever it is. And then you come to the mouthfeel, which is very linked to that visual texture that we talked about. And you want to see whether it's watery, whether it is full, whether it's luscious, whatever it is. Think of the spectrum of being from water to honey. So that's the kind of spectrum that you could have. And finally, there's a thing called finish. So finish could be two things, whether it's a long finish or a short finish. A short finish is like if you drink water, nothing's going to be there, right? After that, it's not going to linger. But if you have tea, that is going to linger and it's going to, leave that dryness on your mouth. Similarly, what you're getting on the finish, think of kind of like the residual taste that you're going to have on your palate. That is the other aspect of your finish. So you're looking for flavor in the nose, you're looking for it on the palate, and you're looking for it in the finish, right? So those are the three steps. So what I'm going to do now is I'm just going to quickly pour. Okay, I'll just pour this rye. Just a small. I know it's Saturday, but it's still very early. Okay. So first thing what I do is, so a lot of the time what I see people doing is they look at whiskey like this. You're going to have different light in the room. You're going to have, like, for example, I've got an umbrella here. You look at it against that, I'm going to get some random color. So what you always do is you hold a white sheet and look at the color against that. That's very important, right? And then don't do this. I have a bad habit of doing this, but please don't do it, because then if you stick your nose in, the alcohol is going to burn it. And you rotate, right? Just rotate gently and then look at the legs. So if you see the legs in this, I'm not able to focus, but it's coming down quite slowly because this is a thick viscous whiskey, right? So that's what you're looking for. If it came down really fast, I would expect a watery mouthfeel, but now I'm expecting quite a thick mouthfeel. You can see the drops, they're still hanging there. Yeah. So next thing is a nosing, but I'm going to just take a second to talk about the glass that I have, right? So this is a Glencairn glass. You don't need a Glencairn for whiskey, but you just get something that is tulip shaped. The idea is you have the bowl which collects the vapors, and then you have the the neck and the mouth, which taper the vapors into the nose. Use an ISO glass, use a small white wine glass, but just look for that taper. Yeah. And the next thing is, don't stick your nose right in. Keep it about an inch away and move it from nostril to nostril. Right. So what happens is, why you move it from nostril to nostril is supposedly every 4 hours your dominant nostril switches, or you might have a blocked nostril. Either way, go nostril to nostril and slowly work your nose into it. And with whiskey, you need to take your time. Don't rush it. Let it open up a little bit if you have the time. Let it open up a little bit. Take some time and keep nosing it. And then what you do is you take a sip and you make sure that the whiskey rotates around your mouth. Chew the whiskey, almost like eat it, right? Because what you're doing is you're adding your saliva to it and you're breaking down the molecules and you're bringing out all those flavor compounds. And so when if you just see what I do right now, it's called the Kentucky Chew. And as it goes down and you get that warmth in your body, it's called the Kentucky Hug. So what you're doing is you're just coating your mouth, and the first sip of the day is always going to be about the alcohol, right? Your body is not meant to be consuming 40%, 50% strength alcohol. It will go into a little bit of shock, right? So give it a little time and then take another sip and slowly think about the flavors. Give it time. Time is absolutely critical. So I'm just going to take another sip. And some people just breathe in a little air also to bring out the vapors. So I'm getting a lot of spice. So rye is a very spicy grain. I'm getting a lot of spice, and the mouthfeel was nice and full. The finish is long, spicy. I'm not really going to get into tasting notes because it's not relevant, but that is the structure of a tasting essentially. Yeah, and another thing that I would recommend is actually a few things that I would recommend is one, compare whiskeys, do side by sides. At least two whiskeys we're starting off tasting. A lot of the time I do 3 or 4 because it's all relative. And another thing is just get like a small pipette. I had one here, but it's not here. Something to just drop water into the whiskey, because as you dilute the whiskey, it changes. Master distillers, what they do is they dilute all the way to 20% ABV in order to get the spectrum of flavors. Ice you wouldn't use at all in tasting because it contracts the molecules. When you're tasting, only thing that you do is have neat and with water. When you're drinking, you do whatever you want. Yeah. So that brings us to the end of the tasting section. But I have to say something. All of you are young. I don't want to sound like an uncle or anything, but I mean, I lived across the world, traveled, partied, all that. But one thing that you get out of it is the most important thing is your health. So I'd say drink responsibly, drink less, but drink better whenever you're legally allowed to drink. Drink responsibly, drink to enjoy. Don't drink to get hammered. Drink to enjoy. I'll just keep it short and leave it at that. And that brings us to the end, guys. I hope you enjoyed it. That 1 hour just ran through. I'm happy to take any questions that you have right now.
Rachna, over to you.
Thank you so much for the session, sir. It was really interesting. I'm sure all of us enjoyed it. So our first question from the training coordinator of IHM Chennai is, are Scotch whiskies from pot and Irish whiskey from the same patent still, and does the mix still exist?
So what happens is, so there's pot still whiskey in both, right? So if you see, I ran you through the categories of Scotch. So all your single malt is pot distilled. This is by law. and all your single grain is column distilled, right? In fact, that Loch Lomond that I have up there is 100% malted barley, but it can't be called a single malt because it was distilled in a patent still, a coffee still, column still. So that is the Scotch part of it. Irish is the same. There's the same definition for single malt and single grain. The only other thing with Irish whiskey, this was in the 1700s. So what happened was the English government was trying to figure out how to tax the rampant distilling that was happening. So they couldn't tax the finished product, which was the new make, because these are all like it was a very fragmented industry. So what they did was they decided to tax the input, which was the malted barley. So the reason why barley is malted is because enzymes start coming out and that breaks the starch into sugar. But what these Irish distillers figured out was they didn't need to use 100% malted barley. They just needed a portion of malted, and the rest could be unmalted, which is not taxed, and they made whiskey out of that. So that is a style that came to be known as single pot still whiskey. So there are whiskies like Red Breast, Green Spot, Red Spot, No Gold Spot. Sorry, bad joke. And Powers, all these that are single pot still whiskies. So if you take duals, this is a blend of single malt and single grain. Whereas if you take Jameson, this is a blend of single pot still and single grain, right? So that is fundamentally, so the classic Irish whiskey is a single pot still. I would highly recommend if you can find Redbreast, look for it. It's fantastic whiskey.
Thank you. The next question is, in India, there's a saying that all blended whiskies are made from molasses only. For example, McDowell blend or Stride, etc. So can you please clarify?
So historically, number of them. So first of all, you need to understand what a blended whiskey is in the Indian context. So in the Scotch context, you have to use spirit from grain that has been aged at least for 3 years. In India, you can make blended whiskey out of unaged neutral alcohol made from anything, right? And you need to only put 2% of malt or grain spirit in that, right? With me so far. So historically, you could use anything made from molasses. But what's happened over time is, one, you had the multinationals, Diageo, Pernod, all these guys coming into India, and they started moving a little towards changing that neutral spirit. Rather than getting it from molasses, they started moving towards a grain spirit. Secondly, what happened was the government has started procuring quite a bit of the molasses ENA. So what's happening is the prices of grain alcohol and molasses alcohol is pretty much normalized. And for example, I'd gone to a distillery in Rajasthan, which makes a neutral spirit out of rice. And that spirit is going into one of the largest selling whiskies in the world, which they were bottling. I can't say names. So if one of the largest selling Indian whiskies in the world is using grain-based alcohol, it's the myth doesn't hold anymore. That said, the biggest problem in the Indian industry is there's no transparency, right? So I can go buy a bottle of any Indian whiskey, whether it's from the regular or prestige segment or whatever it is. I know that there is some amount of ENA in it, but I don't know how much. I don't know what coloring and flavoring are going into it. So that's why I really appreciate guys like Amrut and Paul John and all of them who are coming out with single malts, which would meet SWA laws. Unfortunately, we don't really have enough information about blended spirits to really have confidence to talk about what's in them.
Thank you. The next question is difference between short finish and a long finish in whiskey tasting. I think you've already covered a bit of that.
Yeah, I covered it. I think it all comes down to, what's on your palate at the end. The short finish or a long finish is how long does it linger? Does it linger for a short while or does it linger for a long while? But I'll tell you this, whether it's visual texture or mouth feel or, a short and long finish, this is always a sliding scale. As you drink more and more and more and more whiskeys, you'll realize that what you thought was a full mouthfeel like 3 years ago would probably be a medium now. This is a function of access, is a function of how much you can afford and all these things. I would encourage you guys, when you if who ends up working at bars, speak with your managers. Try to taste as much as you can. Build your repertoire, and like I said, don't only limit it to. Whiskey, for example, so I run this whiskey ambassador certification. So one of the whiskeys that we taste in that is a Lafroig 10. So the gentleman who's a tea sommelier, he was attending this, and the first thing that he said was, "This tastes like Lapsang Souchong tea," right? Which I thought was absolutely phenomenal because he has that knowledge, he's able to give context to a lot of other spirits. So do gin, do wine, do everything. And if you're working in hospitality, it's a great opportunity to, because not all of us can afford to buy, so many bottles and all that, right? Maximize the opportunities, talk to your managers and expand your repertoire.
Thank you. The next question is, how effective are Indian whiskeys as a customer choice all over the world?
It's a good question. So what if you really look at it, right? If you, I mean, sure, some of you would have traveled abroad, or even increasingly in India, there is just so much choice. There is an incredible amount of choice out there. So to get shelf space and to get visibility is very, very hard. So yes, your Amruts and Paul Johns and Rampours and all might be winning a lot of awards, but they're still very young, and they need a lot of support. So for example, what I do, and it's not only limited to the single malts, is when I travel abroad or I have friends who come here, I give them a bottle of, Paul John, or give them a bottle of Casulo Feni. I'm just looking at what I have here, to go and spread the good word. But to answer your question, they have made a lot of headway. It is primarily the hardcore whiskey drinking market that knows about the Indian whiskies. There's a long way to go, but I believe there's a good quality product. What they are working on is trying to build a category, but just three brands, it's hard to build a category. So hopefully in the next decade or so, we'll have a category which can go out as kind of like an association and brand, and really expand the market. I hope that answered the question. Actually, sorry, I'll just give you one more thing, right? So last year I was at Whiskey Live Paris, and I was promoting some whiskey tours that I do. So I was at the Amrut and the Paul John stalls. And at some point, because it got so busy, I started pouring whiskey at the Amrut stall. And what I found was, so many people were, sorry, I just had to cut something. So many people are bringing their friends to the Amrut stall, saying, if you haven't tasted Amrut Fusion, you have to taste it now, right? Because it has just captured the whiskey imagination of whiskey enthusiasts in Europe by just being a quality whiskey. And then they taste the Amrut Fusion and then taste the other things, and then the word spreads. But it takes time. It was a long answer.
Thank you. The next question is, what is the general flavor of any whiskey? Is it bitter or sour, etc.?
Wow. You'd have to find out for yourself. So one thing is, if I would assume that with that question that you're not a spirit drinker, the first challenge when you get into whiskey is that it's 40% alcohol minimum, right? So That's going to be a challenge. So I would say don't start drinking it neat. Drink it as a cocktail, drink it with water, whatever it is. Broadly, the characteristics, it's very hard to generalize, but I'd say it's going to be a little bit of sweetness, little bit of graininess, little bit of oak, little bit of vanilla is what you would generally see in most whiskies.
The next question is, how are the congeners added? Is it present in the cask or is it being added separately?
No, nothing is added. So what happens is the esters and congeners form during two points. It starts forming from your fermentation, like I was talking about. And the longer you ferment, the more esters and congeners you get. And then in your casks, it's completely natural. It's all by the chemical process and the oxidation that's happening within that cask. If I'm talking about like quality Indian single malts, Scotch, Irish, American, and all that, right? In these laws, you cannot add any congeners or any, sort of additives to it. In Canadian whiskey, you're allowed to add 5% of other spirits, as I understand. So you can add like 5% volume of sherry, for example. But that doesn't dilute the whiskey in any way.
The next question is, I'm a teetotaler, so if I'm having whiskey for the first time, what should I expect?
What should you expect? I would hope that you can expect something fantastic, but just a tip when you're starting, I would recommend starting off with something really light. If you're going to start with like a Scotch or something like that, or a Indian single malt, do like a Ballantine's or like a Paul John Nirvana, something really light. You don't want to start with like a Lafroig 10 or something and be like, oh my God, what is this, and never come back to whiskey. There are some people who started with Lafroig 10 and love it, but that's the minority. So like I said, start off with dilution, or if you're a teetotaler completely, start off with dilution. Don't start drinking neat. If you want to put ice in it, put ice in it. That's fine. If you want to put a mixer that doesn't fully dilute the taste, use soda or something like that. Try that. Slowly get into whiskey. Don't try to start off drinking like a cask strength whiskey at 60% neat.
Thank you. The next question is, why demineralized water is used for whiskey production?
So what happens is you need water which is basically, so a lot of the distilleries use RO water, they use soft water. The reason for this is if you have any iron, for example, in the whiskey, what happens is it starts to react with the spirit and it blackens the spirit. And also the maintenance in your stills becomes an issue if you don't treat your water before distilling. So if you see, a lot of these distilleries will talk about, the beautiful water source which has been there since the 1700s and gives the perfect water that gives the flavor to the whiskey. A lot of that is not true because it was relevant back in the day, right? Because you didn't have RO plants and all that stuff. So the one of the reasons why whiskey really flourished in Kentucky and Tennessee is the entire region sits on a limestone shelf, right? So the water naturally gets filtered through this and is conducive for whiskey making. So if you get a chance to go to Kentucky or Tennessee, I was there during the rainy season, and the roads are cut. The sides of the roads are cut to make the roads, and you see the water filtering through it. It's absolutely incredible, right? So naturally filtered water led to successful whiskey making historically, but nowadays people can just put a bore well and an RO plant and you're good to go.
The next question is, what is Tennessee whiskey and how is it different from bourbon?
That's a good question. So Tennessee whiskey has one additional step as compared to bourbon. which is what's called the Lincoln County process. So what happens is they'll take a large stack of sugar maple wood, they'll burn it, and then they'll take the whiskey and drop it through that to filter through and mellow out the whiskey, and there's a certain sweetness also that comes to it. So it was actually really pushed forward by Jack Daniels, and so Jack Daniels is the premier Tennessee whiskey, but it's also followed by other people like George Dickel and all those kind of brands. So that's a fundamental difference. So there's this argument that happens as to whether Tennessee whiskey can be called a bourbon. For the longest time, you know, Tennessee whiskey, like Jack Daniels is like, no, we're not a bourbon, we're a Tennessee whiskey, right? But now, if you listen to the master distiller of Jack Daniels talking, he'll be like, yeah, we're a bourbon, because they want to be part of that bourbon boom, right? They don't want to miss it. So it's debatable, because the thing is, you can't add flavor to bourbon. Bourbon laws are the stricter than you know Scotch, for example. So if the flavor is getting added by that sugar maple filtration, that's one of those debatable things that you have two different camps. Is Tennessee whiskey a bourbon or not? Technically, they say you can call it that. But yeah, it depends on which camp you're in.
Okay. The next question is bottled and bond bourbon whiskey. What is the specialty of this, sir?
So the Bottled and Bond Act came out because there was a lot of there was no what do you say, regulation in the market back in the day. So I don't remember the exact year that the Bottled and Bond Act came out, but basically what they were trying to do was they were trying to build trust in the product, to say, this is a product that meets certain criteria, and you can be assured there's a certain quality for your money that you pay. So a bottled and bond whiskey. Okay, so first of all, a bourbon. A lot of people think that bourbons need to be aged for a long period, but as per the law, it says it needs to be aged in a new charred oak container. So let's say if you go to the still, with an oak bucket, new charred oak bucket. You take it, go take the white dog, carry it 10 seconds over to the bottling line and bottle it. That's a bourbon, right? But then you have different age requirements. So like a straight bourbon is a couple of years old, or a bottled in bond is 4 years old. It needs to be made from new make from one season. It needs to be 100 proof, which is 50% alcohol. So all these conditions built faith in the product and made sure that you were getting a quality product. I don't have a bottled and bond here, but a bottled and bond basically gives you an assurance of quality. It was more relevant back in the day, but now because the laws are so tight anyway and there's so much transparency, you don't really need a bottled and bond certification.
Thank you. Whiskeys which are triple cask matured, but wouldn't that overpower the base taste of the spirit? Would that be recommended?
So it is bring out a certain. So if you look at standard releases, for example, say like the Aberfeldy 12, right? This is it's okay. Let's say Balvenie, which is a double wood, which is double mature, right? So which is finished. So there's two different things. So one is you can age the whiskeys separately, then you can blend it, or you can age it in a certain cask and then finish it in a certain cask, right? There's It depends on what that distiller has historically done, that blender has historically done, and that is their distillery character. So now, for example, so let's say you take a Glenmorangie original. I think it's back there, right? So that is aged 10 years in a bourbon cask, and that is a very distinctive character of Glenmorangie. All the whiskies are initially aged in bourbon casks, and then Dr. Bill Lumsden, who's one of the pioneers of finishing, will move them into other casks, right? It's, for example, Kinter Reuben is in a port cask, a La Santa is in a sherry cask, and all that stuff. So then it comes down to the skill of that master blender. If he doesn't know what he's doing, then one flavor will overpower the other flavor. The absolute beauty of blending is you can bring out the complexities from each of the components. So let's say you start off with your new make, yeah, which gives you kind of like the base to build your whiskey on, and then you age it in bourbon, and then you age it in sherry. You have an Amrut Kadambam which is aged in 5 different casks. If it is done well, then you get that new make character, and then you get that sherry character, you get that bourbon character that all sing together. But it's a very good question, because if you take, so for example, for me, if I was given a choice to taste between a 12-year-old and an 18-year-old of any particular brand, I would choose the 12-year-old, because there'll be more of the new make character maintained than that 18-year-old, which will probably have more of a sherry character and less of that distillery character or new make character. It's a very good question. I hope that answered your question.
Thank you. So what does cask strength mean?
Another good question. So when you talk about a single malt, again, going back to the Aberfeldy. So what happens here is you have multiple casks that you vat and then you bottle, right? So if you take all those casks, so if you just take one cask and put it straight in a bottle, that is a cask strength. Cask strength, single cask, single malt, because it is a single malt from one cask and it has not been diluted. So cask strength, single cask, single malt, right? Now, if you took that same single cask, added water to it and bottled it, that would just be a single cask, single malt, because it's no longer cask strength. Cask strength is if you don't add water to it. Now what happens is if you take two casks, vat them and bottle them, that is a cask strength single malt, no longer single cask. I hope you're with me. Now, if you take multiple casks, mix them together, add water, and bring it down to this 40%, that is just a single malt. So you have single malt, you have a single cask single malt, you have a single cask strength single malt, and a cask strength single malt. 4 different types. I hope I didn't confuse you.
Thank you, sir. The next question is there any specific percentage of malt and grain whiskey in blended Scotch whiskey?
No, there isn't. There's no mandated thing, and they're not really going to tell you. So just to continue on that, right? So let's say if you take a Johnnie Walker Black Label, it reputedly has over 50 malt and grain whiskies in it. That proportion, first of all, they're not going to tell you what it is. Secondly, that proportion will constantly change, because their goal is to maintain the taste profile of Johnnie Walker Black Label 12-year-old. It is not their endeavor to always keep it 20% Kalila, 5% this, 5% that, right? So that will constantly change, but there is nothing in the law that says any particular percent needs to be used. There is a law in Ireland for single pot still whiskey, which has, 30% malted barley, minimum 30% malted barley, minimum 30% unmalted barley, and a maximum of 5% other grains. But that's another discussion.
Okay, the next question is, how does still shape and design affect the whiskey?
Wow, good question. Let me quickly go back to that. Sorry. Yeah, so if you see here, there's multiple factors. One is the height of the still. So first of all, one thing that you need to understand is the concept of reflux. So reflux is basically when you're boiling up the wash, or let's just say wash for now, and the vapor is going up, If it condenses on the way up and falls back down, that's reflux. So basically means it's getting distilled multiple times. So higher reflux means a lighter spirit, right? So just, I didn't want to get too technical, but since you asked the question, so what happens is you heat up the vapor, it goes up the neck, and then it goes down that horizontal thing called the line arm, and it goes into that vertical tube called the condenser, which has cold water going around, and the vapor is condensed into liquid, and that is your new make. That is a very simplistic way of doing it. Read more in that blog that I shared, right? So now what happens is if it's a really long neck, there's going to be more reflux. If you have any obstruction like the boil balls that you see here, that's going to cause reflux. If you have a line arm that's going up, that's going to bring your vapor back down, that's going to cause more reflux. So in the opposite, if it's a short still, less reflux, no boil ball, less reflux, downward line arm, easier movement, less reflux, so that will give you a heavier spirit. That's in a nutshell. Uh, there's more technical stuff to that. But generally speaking, that's how it works.
Thank you, sir. I think we don't have any more questions. Any more questions? Please put it down in the chat box. Okay, we have one question. So what is the difference between Johnnie Walker's Black Label and Johnnie Walker's Double Black Label?
Good question. So the malt that gives you the smoky peaty flavor in your Black Label and Double Black is Kolila, single malt. So in the Black Label, you have a lower amount of peated single malt, and the Double Black you have a higher amount, so to give you more of a smoky flavor. Obviously, there are other differences also in terms of the blend, which you really, nobody's going to tell you, right? So broadly speaking, the Johnnie Walker is less peated and the Double Black is more peated. Personal taste preference of mine, I find the Black Label better because I just find it more balanced and more complex.
Thank you, sir. It would be a great help if you could share the whiskey flavor chart, because some of them have asked for it.
Oh, sure.
Then
I think somebody wanted, yeah, please, yeah.
No, please continue, sir.
No, please. I shouldn't be reading the screen. I'll let you ask the questions.
Can you please repeat the cask strength portion?
Yeah, I realized I confused you a little bit there. So basically what happens is, so let's say you have two casks, right, which are maturing whiskies. So for most of the single malts in the market, what happens is you will vat the whiskey in both the casks, and then you will water it down. So the reason why you water it down is not everybody wants to have something that is a very high ABV. Typically, at the end of your maturation, your ABV will be in the high 50s, more or less. I'm talking about, reasonably aged malts. I'm not talking about 40, 50-year-olds, right? So let's say it's a 12-year-old or whatever. Strength that the new make goes into the cask at is normally 63.5%. Where you age it, change it. Might go anywhere to 50. It is the cask strength of the cask strength bottling. If you water it down to 40% or 46 or whatever, and you put it in the bottle, that's just a single malt. The other part is if you didn't vat two casks, if it just came from one cask, then you add single cask to it, or in the case of American whiskey, single barrel, just to keep it simple.
Thank you, sir. The next question is, what's so unique about rye whiskey?
So I'll just talk about American rye for the time being, basically what I'm drinking right now. So if you're a bourbon, you need to be 50, at minimum of 51% corn, and then you can add the other grains to your bourbon. But with the rye, you need to be at least 51% rye, right? And then you can add corn, barley, whatever. What is different with the rye as compared to say wheat or say corn is it's much spicier, kind of. This is a very broad generalization, don't just to give you an idea of the top notes, right? So let's say if you go and have a wheat beer as compared to an IPA, right? So wheat beer is going to be mellow, soft, and IPA is going to give you the stronger hoppy floral kind of characters. Generally speaking, I just use it as a comparison to talk about, say, if I'm comparing a Maker's Mark, which is a bourbon that has wheat in it, as compared to a Pikesville, which is a 51% minimum rye. Right? So it's spicier in a nutshell.
So the next question is how to pair whiskey with food.
That's a very good question. There's something that I'm still trying to crack. See, the thing is, it's very, 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 very dependent on the chef you're working with. It depends on you know the flavor profiles, because it's very hard to generalize. Generally speaking, what happens is you talk about, like, peated whiskey with oysters, peated whiskey with salmon. You talk about whiskey and chocolate. You talk about whiskey and ham, which are very singular flavors. When it comes to anything more complex, what you need to do is you have to taste it side by side. So let's say, for example, on the other day, a gentleman was asking me, what whiskey will go with an Indian meat curry? I'm like, there are so many cuisines to begin with, right? How, and that's one fact. What meat are you talking about? Which chef are you talking about? What recipe are you talking about? There are too many factors. So I would urge you to start experimenting. But when it comes down to putting anything on a menu, you need to be 100% sure that the flavors will sing together and that you can only do by trial and error, to be perfectly honest.
Thank you, sir. The next question is what's the difference between Hennessy VSOP and the normal Hennessy?
I'm really not a cognac expert, but as far as I know, there's VSOP, and XO. I believe, I'm not exact. It's all age dependent. As far as I know, an XO is at least 6 years old, if I'm not wrong. I think I'm not sure. It's all age related. I'm slowly getting into cognac, so I'm not going to claim to know the exact definitions.
The next question is, can you please tell us about the processing of Tennessee whiskey?
Yeah, let me see if I have a picture. Can give you a better idea. Just give me a second. I'm just picking up a picture from my visit to Jack Daniels. Just bear with me. Lots of distillery pictures. Okay, I'm just going to share this. Just going to share my entire screen. It's easier. Can you see my screen? Can you see my screen?
No, sir, I can't really see.
Okay, sorry. Yeah. All right, you should be able to see it now. Yeah?
Yes, we can see it now. Yes.
Okay. All right. So if you see this, right? So this is a Jack Daniels. So what they do is they take this stack. This is sugar maple wood. It's not a pallet, right? So they take this and then they go and put it here, and then they burn it, right? So basically, what you're getting is it's like a sugar maple wood charcoal, right? And then what they do is they'll take it into the main building. They'll put it in these large 20-foot vats, and they'll slowly drip it. And you can't take photographs in this, so I couldn't take photos, but they'll slowly drip it through this. So as it slowly drips through that 20 feet of charcoal, the sugar maple wood, it slowly gets mellowed and rounded and sweeter. So, like for example, if we take the Jack Daniels number 7 versus the Gentleman Jack, the Gentleman Jack will be lighter, more elegant. The reason is, so they take that number 7 filtered whiskey and then they refilter it in 10 feet of sugar maple charcoal, right? So it's a double filtration in a half size stack, the second 10, that gives you a mellower, more kind of an elegant whiskey.
Thank you, sir. I think that is our last question we had.
Okay.
Now we'll be moving on to a slightly fun session where it's going to be a rapid fire round. I'll be asking you.
They told me about this. Okay.
I'll be asking you a couple of questions, and you'll have to answer it in one word or one sentence.
Okay.
All right. So the first question is, what do you like to do in your spare time?
Spend time with my daughter.
Okay.
Family.
That's nice. The second one is, who is your biggest inspiration in life?
My grandfather.
Okay. The next one is your favorite brand and type of whiskey.
Springbank, the orange one back there.
I see. The next one is, what is your worst experience that you've ever had through your career?
I think at multiple times, I can't answer this in one word, but I think at multiple times I found myself doing something that I didn't enjoy. And every time I switched careers to, follow something that was my passion, which is what I'm doing right now. And I would urge you all to do that as well. Follow your passions. Life is too short to do something that you don't enjoy.
I agree. That is some good advice. And the next one is, what is your biggest strength?
My biggest strength? Honesty.
Okay. The next one is, how and why did you start your career as the Whisky Advisor?
So if you see my background, I have traveled the world, lived in different places, had multiple careers across technology, business, restaurants, all the stuff. But I reached a point where, again, I just wanted to follow my dream. I love whiskey. I love traveling. And I want to one day also start whiskey tours to all these different countries. So, maybe you guys will join me on one of those one day. But I think for me, whiskey and travel is my world, really.
Okay, the next one is, which is the most aged whiskey that you have ever had? Or the oldest whiskey?
I've had a couple actually, both were 50 years old. One was, the blend, I've had a blended scotch, which was 50, and had a few 40-something-year-old single malts.
Okay, so the next question is an interesting question. So in the beginning of the session, you told us, you had presented a scenario when a guest is walking up to you and asking you to choose the whiskey that you would sell. So we are putting an Uno reverse card for you. So how would you, ask a customer or ask a guest as to, what whiskey would you sell to the guest when he doesn't know about it?
Excellent question. So First thing is, you've got to generally gauge the guest, right? See how adventurous, how much he's willing to spend, how much he's not going to ask him that, right? Don't want to throw something at him that's overpriced. Also, you want to. So the first objective is to give him a fantastic experience. He's going to go away with a great memory. The second part of it is the business aspect of it, but you always got to keep it in mind. So I would ask him, what do you normally like to drink? Do you like something sweet? Do you like something smoky? If the person is a beer drinker or a person is a wine drinker or a vodka drinker, listen, ask what they normally like, what kind of flavor profiles they prefer, and then you can give them 2 to 3 options, and this is where your knowledge comes into it, right? So for example, let's say if he likes something smoky, then you would probably offer a PT whiskey, right? If you like something really sweet, and then you'd probably, for example, just as an example, let's say you can tell them the story of the Jack Daniels and Gentleman Jack, right? Or, for example, let's say if a person is a Valentine's drinker and they want to try a single malt. Do you know what the component malts are? The Glenbergie, the Milton Duff, the Glentalkers. Do you have it in your bar? Because Pernod recently released those single malts on the market. So it's all about, if you have the knowledge and you're listening, you're always going to win. But the problem is, if you're only trying to sell and you don't know what you have in your bar, you're not knowledgeable about what you have in your bar, what kind of experience is that person going to have? So listen and learn. Those are the 2 things I'd say.
Thank you so much for such an interesting session. And I'm sure all of us had a very good time. Over to you, Mani sir.
I just like to say, if you don't mind, if you guys want to know more, I'm on Instagram, I do YouTube and all this stuff, and it's all free knowledge out there. So if you want to learn more about whiskey, please check it out. Yeah. Please, sorry, Mr. Mani, I didn't mean to cut you short.
Yeah, thank you, sir. Thank you for a wonderful session. You poured spirit into our soul during these peril times. On the outset, I'd like to thank Mr. Uday Balaji for this amazing session. He certainly has left us high on with his talks. I would like to thank Dr. Eugene, our placement coordinator, Mr. D. Ilongovan, our senior lecturer, and our student fraternity from IHM Chennai, Arjun and Rachna for the tech backup. Thank you. Thank you for hosting us. Lastly, I'd like to thank all those who have joined us and became a part of this session. Thank you all and have a good day. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, everyone. I'll just sign off by saying cheers, and I hope to meet all of you one day in person. Cheers.
Cheers. And our student fraternity from IHM Chennai, Arjun and Rachna for the tech backup. Thank you. Thank you for hosting us. Lastly, I'd like to thank all those who have joined us and became a part of this session. Thank you all and have a good day. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, everyone. I'll just sign off by saying cheers, and I hope to meet all of you one day in person. Cheers.
Cheers. And our student